Okay, we're rolling. Vocal check 1, 2. Good. Okay, here we go. We're in the Cisco lab at South Campus, and we're going to show here taping for the Advanced Cisco cohort, how to do the Tftp function, and also how to do password recovery. I pre-configured a router and a switch and a workstation with some basic IP addressing stuff on it. So here's the desktop PCA I'm using, and I'll show you what I did here to configure it. I went into the Cisco lab, shortcut, and went to the TCP IP screen and made it 1.1.1.11, and the default gateway, that's the port on the router that is connected to, is 1.1.1.1, and the switch, the workgroup switch, is going to be 1.1.1.2. It has to have an IP address in order to be able to ping the TFTP server and connect to it. So that's configured. And just to prove our connectivity, I'll try to ping my default gateway, and that's good. And then I'll ping the workgroup switch, which is 1.1.1.2, and that's good as well. So let's take a glance at those iOS configurations. So I set the password to Cisco, and then get to the privilege exec mode. It's going to be class. So if I do a show IP interface brief, the only thing I've configured is the gigabit port 0/1 is connected to port 5 on the switch. Well, if it's let's show CDP neighbor, since I talk about that all the time. My port 01 on the router, here at the router prompt here, is connected to port 5 on the Ethernet switch, and then port 6 of this Ethernet switch is going to my PCA. That's the normal wiring topology we use here. I've just configured the default gateway port G01 to be 1.1.1.1, and I've created a loopback port on purpose because when we go into password recovery, there's a gotcha. After you recover the password, all the ports are shut down. You have to do the no shutdown to bring them up again. I have configured OSPF so that when you go to the workstation and try to ping that loopback port, you should be able to ping it properly. I didn't test that. Let's test that. I should be able to ping 11.11.11.11, and I can ping that okay, because the routing protocol is running on the router just fine. Now, when I do this TFTP function, what I'm going to do is copy from the router, I'm going to copy the startup configuration file, do a show start. Did it save this, didn't I? Yeah, it started. It's saved. I'm going to save the startup configuration from the router, and also as an exercise, we're going to save the iOS file. That c1900.bin file, 75 meg. That's the operating system for this. And then on the switch, I'll save the startup configuration to show that. So let me go to the switch and check the configuration on that. The password Cisco. To get to the privilege exec mode, I should be able to say class, which is configured. And if I do a show IP interface brief, I assign that management address 1.1.1.2 to the VLAN 1 interface, and that's why we're able to ping it. I also made a loopback port on the switch as well, made it 12.12.12.12, just so it has a loopback port. You can't do that on switches as well as routers. Okay, now let's jump back to our desktop PC, our VMware desktop PC, and what I'm going to do is show this program that I pre-installed. TFTP D32 is a open source type TFTP server. When you hear the word server, you think expensive hardware, expensive proprietary software like Microsoft Server or something like this. But the TFTP is the stripped down version of FTP that you don't need a name and a password. And it's stuck to one directory. So in this program, I've pointed it to the C drive. I created a folder called Z on the C drive. By default, it wants to go to the program files, and we don't have any permissions to go into the program files on these desktop PCs. Only the system has permission to go there. And if you have more than one network interface adapter on your device, you can pick the different ones you want it to come in from. So on this desktop PC, we only have our real interface, which is I configured to be 1.1.1.11, that goes out the real Ethernet port and goes to the switch and the router. And then the loopback port 127.0.0.1 doesn't go to anything, so we can't use that. We have to use the real one that's already there. Okay, so I'm going to go to the router first, And I'll leave this at the bottom because we'll be able to watch the action on the TFTP screen as it takes place. So best practice is when you do a TFTP to a server, you should first verify connectivity. So I should be able to ping 1.1.11. Oops, ping my own address. I can ping the TFTP server, it's just fine. Okay, the command for copying something is the same as the DOS command. If I want to copy from the C drive to the D drive, I would say copy C:, file, space, D:, and it would copy it. So what I want to do is I want to copy the startup configuration file to the TFTP server. Now, he's going to ask me some questions after I press the enter key. First of all, what is the IP address of that TFTP server? That's 1.1.1.11. That's the workstation. And what do you want me to call the startup configuration file when I place it on there? By default, he takes the host name of the router, which is R1, and a dash and the word config. You can change that if you want to. So if I was backing up S1 and R1, we'll be able to see in a minute that there's R1 is the backup of my router configuration, and S1 config will be the backup of my switch configuration. So I press enter, it copied it. If you were looking fast, we can see there's an action here. It saved R1 configuration on there. Well, let's check and make sure. I'm going to say, show me the directory. And I'm going to go to the File Explorer. And there's our R1 config file. It's essentially a text file that we backed up. So it's been saved to the system. Now this second one I'm going to do will take a few more seconds because it's the whole operating system file. I want to copy, to do this route, I got to do a little copy and paste so I don't have to type the characters in. So I'm going to copy the file name, which, it'd be hard to type that out exactly correctly. Then I'll say copy the flash to the TFTP server. TFTP. Well, what's that source file name? And this is where I can just go in here and click and it pastes it, so I don't have to type it in. What's our IP address of the TFTP server? 1.1.1.11. Destination file name, by default, it's going to be exactly the same. I could change it if I wanted to. It's copying, and it'll take a minute to do this because it's 75 meg. So how much is it copied so far? It's copied 1, 2, 3, 8 meg. 9 meg, it'll take a few more seconds to copy it. So let's just wait a second for that to copy. If you just have a single Cisco device or a single router and a switch, and you haven't bought SmartNet, you don't have the ability to go and download a replacement file. If somebody accidentally erases it or there's a hardware failure, it's a good idea you can back up. Now we're doing it to a TFTP server. You could also copy it to a thumb drive. You could take a thumb drive, a USB thumb drive, and plug it into that USB port on the router, and you could copy it to that. So at least you have a backup copy of it in case something happens to it. How far has it got now? 26 meg, 27 meg, 28 meg. It's counting up to about 75 meg and it'll be copied. After this finishes, I'm going to switch over to the switch console, and I'm just going to do the startup configuration file is only like a couple hundred characters. It takes no time at all. So we're watching and we're waiting for this to take place and be copied. And when it's present, I'll be able to show that it's present in that C:/Z folder that I created on the machine. Up to 42, not too much longer, it'll be all done. We're connected at, now the router does have gigabit Ethernet ports. I know what I should have done here. I should have connected this workstation PCA to the gigabit port. The 2 gigabit ports we have on our switches have 24 fast Ethernet ports. We just have 2 gigabit ports. I should have connected the PCA to the gigabit port and connected the 2nd gigabit port to the gigabit port of the router, and that would have sped up this file transfer immensely. Rough rule of thumb is when you're running at, say, fast Ethernet speeds, that's 100 million bits per second. A rough rule of thumb is whatever the raw bit rate is, divide that by 10, and that will give you your rough characters. 75 million characters are bytes in this file. So for 100 megabit, we're getting about 10 million bytes per second. And there's a little bit of overhead with the TFTP function because you got to send each one of these exclamation points. It's sending as a block of characters. And then it's kind of like TCP, paths of acknowledgement and retransmission where I got the block, send it back, except that with here it's done now. TFTP uses UDP, so it's not using the built-in TFTP code. It's using his own implementation of that. Okay, it copied it, and it took about 3 minutes. So let's go and verify that that's showing up correctly. I'll type show directory and show me the Explorer. And now we see our 2 files present in there. We have our original backup r1-config of the startup configuration, and we have that 77.75 meg file has been backed up. Now we have a backup copy of our operating system file. All right. Now I want to do a similar thing with the switch. Close that. Go to the switch prompt. So if I do a show startup configuration, I did back it up, so we got something to copy. You can also copy the running configuration. So I'll also copy the startup configuration file to the TFTP server. And the TFTP server is at 1.1.1.11. By default, now it says S1 config, host name of the router. And that just takes no time at all. Okay, let's go back to our operating system, show the directory, file manager, file explorer, and now we see we have backed up both our R1 config and our S1 config have been backed up and they're saved on our TFTP device. So you don't need an expensive rack mount server with expensive hardware. Any cast-off desktop machine that has an Ethernet port will do fine for this. And you can get the TFTP server software is a free open source software. You can get it's like public domain software. You can get it free on the internet. And this is the one they recommend. The Academy recommends to use. There's lots of others in use as well. Cisco even used to publish one, the Cisco TFTP server, but there was a vulnerability found in it 10 or 15 years ago. So their response was they took it off the market. So how do you erase something off the internet? You can find it if you want to. Once you put something on the internet, it's there forever. You can't just destroy it. Okay. Now we can do our file manager, file recovery stuff. And to do that, I can go and shut down this PCA because I don't need it right now. So I always just shut down the VMware gracefully. Don't leave it running. When you log off your computer, student computer, it could create a problem for the next student. As you, VMware locked up on your machine, yeah. Okay, password recovery. Now, he says password recovery. It's really a password reset function. The Cisco curriculum calls it password recovery. Password recovery implies we're going to get the original password back. I don't care what the original password was. I just want to reset the password to something I know. So if someone was working for the company and they left the company and then no one had ever written down the passwords, or maybe they got fired or something and they got mad and they changed all the passwords on purpose and purposely didn't tell anybody what it was. These sort of things sometimes happen. We always need a method of doing password recovery on our network. Our routers and our switches is what I'm going to cover today, but think about what if the system administrator that sets people's passwords on the Microsoft domain controller left and no one knew the password, or he changed the password because he got mad. So long as I can get up close and personal access to that network, to that Microsoft Windows domain controller, I can put in a thumb drive and I can boot up a program that will reset the password to anything I want to, like the enter key or any password that I know. Now, I've already set the passwords on these to Cisco in class, but let's pretend that we did not know what the passwords are, and I'm going to show you how to get to the privilege exec mode and change the password without knowing what the first original password is. So it's slightly different on the router and on the switch. So here's what we're going to do on the switch. I'm going to reset the switch, and then while it's booting up, I have 60 seconds to go into the Terraterm program and send the break character. Only the first 60 seconds. Now think of a Windows machine. When you boot up a Windows computer, there's a brief period of time where you can press it's F5 or F8 or something like that. You can go into safe mode, where you can do stuff like if you install a VGA driver for your new video gaming card and the screen gets all wonky, you need to reset it to the safe mode 640 by 480 so you can fix that problem. So this is the same thing. We got a brief period of time where we can do this. So let's see, I've saved it. I should be able to reload it. I'll give it a second to start reloading. And the switch is complaining because the router is reloading and shutting down. Just to guarantee this, I'm going to switch the router off. Now, I should be able to go control, send break, and I'm going to have to wait a few seconds for the router to start doing the boot load, doing the power step test, and start loading this. I'll try it again. Control, send break. Okay, now it looks like he's starting to do something. Control, send, there we go. Read only, Raman initialized, Ram monitor, Raman. Madam Raman, the psychic Cisco help desk girl. I'm going to call you and have to reset the password. So it says Raman 1. Okay, this is when we talk about in our fundamentals class, the stripped down version of the iOS that's present in the ROM chip. We did not load the flash memory. We bypassed the loading of the flash memory. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here, and there's a configuration register that's present that's normally set to 2102. Show version, it'll say 2102, normal boot up process. Do not press the F5 and F8 key on your Windows machine. Let it boot up normally. So what I have done is I've interrupted that process, and now I want to set that configuration register to 0x2142, which is a special value. And when the router boots up again, he will boot up, but he will ignore the existing startup configuration file, which I do not want it to load because it contains the passwords I do not know. So I'll tap the command reset. Reset. And I will not interrupt it. And when it finishes resetting, it's going to put that prompt up on the screen. Do you want to go into the setup routine, the setup thing, which you normally answer no to? Because I told to pretend that the startup configuration file, which I did say we did a show start, it's really there. It's in the slash memory. I mean, it's in the NVRAM. It will pretend like it's not there and tell me that I can go into the setup mode, and then I'll be able to get to the privileged exec mode without having knowledge of it, and I'll be able to do a little smoke and mirror stuff and recover the startup configuration file. Okay, so this will take a couple minutes for it to boot up so we can see this. So while it's booting up, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. Let's see, what's the technique? Tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. That's the lecture technique. So what I'm going to do is after it finishes loading up, okay, we can see it's actually compressing the iOS file and loading it up into the RAM files right now, the RAM memory. When it finishes loading up, I'm going to, since it appears to be a router with no configuration, I can type enable, and I'm not asked for the password, just like on you do a lab and there's no configuration yet. I'm going to get to the privileged exec mode, and then I'm going to be able to go in and copy, and you got to watch your fingers now because your muscle memory says copy run start. If I type copy run start right now, I would copy a default running configuration and blow away my startup configuration, which has all the IP addresses and stuff. I want to do that. You have to stop your muscle memory. You have to type copy start run. And that's going to copy the startup configuration. I'm already at the privileged exec mode, and that's going to copy the configuration back in, and then I have to do a little cleanup. I have to clean up a couple things. First of all, I'll reset my enable password to what I want it to be, that I know. And then I have to, see, it's acting like it's not there. Okay, so I'm going to say no. And it always takes a couple seconds after you say no to put about 20 status lines on the screen. About 3 things I have to clean up. A, I got to change the password to something I know. 2, I got to change the configuration back to 2102 so it doesn't do this again in the future. And 3, I have to find any interfaces that I've already configured on that they have to type a no shutdown command to bring them back up. There we go. It looks like a default router. See? If I do a show IP interface brief, there's a default configuration, no addresses, everything's administratively shut down. Now here's the show version. Normally, this last line says the configuration register is 2102. That means boot up normally and load the startup configuration file if it's there to be found. I told it with 2142, I told it to ignore that. All right, so I can type enable and go to the privilege exec mode. Now look at this. I'm going to type the show start, and there's our startup configuration with the password. I can't look at that, see what the password is because it's encrypted. And there's our configuration for the loopback address, and there's our configuration for the Ethernet address, and all the passwords and everything that I put in for the console port. That's all there. So here's why if I type copy run start right now, I blow that away. I got to be very careful here. I got to say copy start to run. I'm R1. I fixed it, except I got to do some more cleanup here. Okay, so if I do a show IP interface brief, there's my IP addresses I set. Now loopback ports, we don't have to worry about loopback ports. They're automatically up and up. But look at that gigabit Ethernet port. It's 1.1.1.1, but it's administratively down. I have to take an extra step, go to the configuration mode and say interface gig 0/1 and do a no shutdown on it. Okay, I took care. I did that for all the ports, the physical ports that were supposed to be up and up and have IP addresses to them. I had to fix those. That fixes that. Okay, now I don't know what the password is. We really know the password's class because that's what it's used. But in the field, this would be some password someone else has set, and you don't know what it is. Even if it's one of the 10 million students that went to the Cisco Networking Academy, they shouldn't use Cisco in class in their companies because everybody knows that. They should use a password that's harder to guess. So enable secret. I'll use class again. That sets the password to something I know. All right. Now, one more thing to fix is that problem with the show version. If I do not change the show version back from 2142 to 2102, the next time the router boots up, he'll ignore the startup configuration file again. This is a mean trick to pull on your. Don't pull this on. Okay, you arrogant advanced Cisco guys, pull this on the guys that are in the fundamentals class, and they will never be able to figure out what's going on. They'll never be able to save their configurations. Okay, so I'm going to do config-register, oops, config-register 0x2102. I'll set that back. Now, watch this weirdness. Show version. It's telling me that it's 2142 right now, but after I boot it again, it's going to go back to 2102. It'll be normal, and we'll be able to our repaired running configuration. Copy run start. I've now repaired the startup configuration file with the password that I know. I've repaired the configuration register back to the proper boot value, and it will boot up normally now with the passwords that I know. So there's password recovery on the router. Okay, good. Now, I'm doing the switch. On the switch, it's done slightly differently. Remember on the router, our secret Cisco enable class. On the router, we had to, in the first 60 seconds, we had to go into the configuration program. We had to do setup and send the control break character. Okay, the switch don't work like that. Switch uses a slightly different method. Before I do this to the switch, I want to type the DR command and show what's going on in the switch here. Now, we know it as show start, show startup-config. In the router, in the switch, it's stored as config.txt. It's aliased. It's kind of like a shortcut in Windows or an alias in Macintosh. The alias can have one name and the actual file has another name. So startup-config is aliased as config.txt. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to reboot the switch, and by holding the button down on the front panel of the switch a certain amount of time, I can tell it to not boot up the operating system, and I will be able to go in there and do something with that config.txt. Let me illustrate this. I'm going to do a erase startup config. And he warns me. Now when I do that dir, notice that config.txt file is gone. Back again. Copy, run, start. We save it. On the physical file system, it's called config.txt. We type startup-config. He does the aliasing for us. Okay, so I'm going to reboot the switch. I'll do a reload. Oh, I'll just pull the power back. Okay, so switches up. Switches. Now, what I got to do is, oh, I should have done this different. So you got to take the power. Switches don't have switches, so we can't turn the switch off. We have to pull the power loose or plug it into a power strip and turn the power strip off. I'm going to hold the button down on the front panel. And I'm going to mash the button up. And I'm going to wait for the green light to stop flashing and turn amber is what the thing is. And this usually takes about 15 to 20 seconds. If I do this correctly, we'll get a boot prompt on the screen. Did that work? Oh, I didn't do it good enough. So it's flashing green. And the button is actually kind of hard to hold down. Got it. Now we got on the screen, we got the switch prompt. So normally what the router or the switch is going to do now when he boots up is he's going to load the flash init is the driver for the flash drive so we can see the files. We need to get to the files on the flash drive and mess with that config.txt. The command boot, after the file system has been loaded into the to the RAM, the boot goes ahead and boots it up. It normally does that automatically. I only want it to load the file system, but don't do anything else. So it's going to initialize the flash system. I don't want the boot up because if it booted up now, it would boot up with the password that I did not know. Okay. Now, when I did a dir on the router, I got to do the dir flash : the syntax is particular here. So there's our config.txt. Okay. I do not want that file to boot up. If I tell the iOS to load up right now, it's going to look for the config.txt file, and he's going to use it to load all the passwords I don't know. I can't delete it, but I can rename it. So I'm going to rename the config.txt. I got to spell it out like it is in the actual file system. I'm going to I'm sorry. I got to rename it flash config.txt, and I'm going to rename that to flash : how about December 2020? Now, if we do the dir flash command again, just to make sure that it worked, config file has been renamed to December 2020. Now, I'm going to allow the machine to boot up. When it boots up, the iOS is going to boot up. He's going to look in the file system for that config.txt. He's not going to find it because I renamed it. And he's going to boot up as if it was a brand new factory fresh machine that has no configuration yet. So what do you think is going to happen next? It's going to be, at this point, it'll be similar to the router. I'll be able to go to the privileged exec mode. I'll be able to copy the existing configuration startup file back into the switch. And then I'll be able to, no config register to fix. I can just resave the configuration as with the passwords that I know now. So on the switch, it's doing these @ signs. It's the same thing it did on the router. It uses the other symbol. It's loading the compressed flash iOS file from the flash drive and loading it into the RAM because flash drive is 10,000 times slower than RAM chips. So doing the power on self-test, checking all the ports, the port application-specific integrated circuits, they look like they're okay. And in a moment here, we should get our prompt on the screen. Do you want to go into the guided configuration setup dialog, which you always answer no to. There it is. Okay. Do you want to go with configuration dialog? Heck no, I don't want to do that. So I say no. So its hostname, default hostname is switch. I'll go to the privilege exec mode. I'll type dir. Here's our December 2020 file. If it had been left to the rename to the config.txt, it would have loaded it. Okay, so what I want to do now is instead of, I don't want to type copy run start. I want to copy that startup file, which I renamed to December 2020, to run and recover the configuration that we had on this switch, which was the host name. I had a loopback address. I had a VLAN 1 address. Okay, so copy from the file system 2020 file to the running configuration. Back to switch 1. All right, look at that. Let's do a show IP interface brief. Look at the VLAN 1. It's administratively down. I'll have to type no shutdown command to repair that problem. The loopback port is up and up because loopback ports are never down and down unless you explicitly type shutdown on them. So I should be able to go to config T, interface VLAN 1, no shutdown. That fixes that. Now I'll go to configuration mode, enable secret. We didn't know what it was. Set it to what we know it is. We fixed that problem. And now copy, run, start. There's no config register on the switch to have to change back to. So we've recovered the configuration on the switch. Most companies don't have good documentation for this, so the only documentation for the network is basically in the startup configs of all the devices. And if you can't know the password, you can't get to them, well, we know password recovery now. We can get to them, we can repair them. So here's your hint about being a consultant and fixing these things. When you go out in the world with your CCNA certification, always carry around a notebook, jot stuff down, and let's work on our verbal skills. Oh, this is bad. And never charge less than $350 to do password recovery. Okay, I'll stop the recording now.